Now, as we speak, Israel and Lebanon also held their highest level direct talks in more than 30 years in Washington. The talks instead went long for around 2 hours. The two sides were represented by their ambassadors to the U.S. and with United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Now, the talks was mediated by Washington. It comes at a critical juncture. On one hand, you have Hezbollah, which has opposed the direct talks. On the other hand, you have Lebanon, which hopes the talks will pave the way to an end of the war. Now, meanwhile, in all of this, Iran has set ending the wars in Lebanon and the region as a condition for talks with the United States. In fact, I'm being joined by my colleague Rishabh on the broadcast here. Rishabh, can you give us the details of the very crucial talks which is happening in Washington, D.C. between Lebanon and Israel? Right. In fact, I think there's some connection issue with my colleague Rishabh on the broadcast here. Viewers, meanwhile, Rubio also warned not to expect immediate agreement in historic Israel-Lebanon talks. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the historic Israel-Lebanon peace talks the U.S. is mediating are a process and not an event, downplaying expectation, of course, for any immediate or significant agreement. Now, meeting at State Department with the ambassador of Israel and Lebanon to the United States, as I was mentioning, along with the U.S. ambassador to Lebanon, Rubio also said the Trump administration is very happy to be facilitating these discussions, which is happening at Washington as we speak. Now, he also goes on to say this is a historic opportunity. That's what Rubio has said. And he also says that U.S. understands that they are working against decades of history and complexity that will not be quickly resolved. In fact, I'm being rejoined by my colleague Rishabh on the broadcast here. Rishabh, can you give us any details about the very crucial talks which is happening in Washington, D.C. as we speak between Israel and Lebanon?
Shubhangi, if we talk about the crucial talks that are taking place in Washington, and I hope the line is clear now for our viewers.
Right, go on.
If we talk about that talk, this is very important talk. Remember, Lebanon is not another Arab country in the region. Lebanon has a history, and Lebanon have had a very calm history with Israel between 1948, when Israel came into existence, till about 1980s, when Hezbollah started gaining momentum in the region. Hezbollah initially started as a resistance front, and then seized the opportunity to actually create a sense of civil war in Lebanon, where the Lebanese government had to surrender and give them political space in Lebanon. And since then, there have been issues between Beirut and Tel Aviv. Now that Lebanese government and especially the northern Lebanese leaders believe that Hamas has been decimated, Iran is trained by this war, and after Nasrallah and other senior leadership of Hezbollah being wiped, Hezbollah does not have much of its say left in the Lebanese society. It is good time to bypass them and have good relationship with Israel and actually sideline Hezbollah. So, see, this is something that is theoretical. This is something which is ideal. But how much of this will become a reality, as Marco Rubio says, immediately there won't be too much of sweeping agreements between the two sides. It will take time.
Of course, Rishabh, it will take time, whether or not these crucial talks after 30 years will yield result or not. But of course, one can hope that there is some amount of discussion and positive discussion which can yield result in Washington, D.C. as we speak. But thank you so much for sharing us with all those details here. But viewers, whether these talks, as I was mentioning, will actually yield result remains to be seen. But it's really important to understand what's at stake here. Number one, prevent escalation between Hezbollah and Israel. That is one of the most crucial points of this talk. Whether or not border security and Iran-America ceasefire terms will be agreed upon and what will be the result of these talks, that is another point which is at stake. As of number 3, of course, there are concerns about the humanitarian situation in Lebanon and the mounting infrastructure damage and civilian casualties, which is only increasing day by day. Number 4, Iran backs Hezbollah, which can impact its strategic role at this point in time. And to sum it all up, any escalation can further add pressure to global trade and energy price, which of course the world is leading on. Of course, in fact, I'm being joined by Stephen J. Rapp, ex-US envoy for war crimes. Thank you so much, sir, for speaking 2 times now. I would like to start by asking you how you would describe the offensive mounted on Iran by US and Israel. Do you think it was necessary, and is there any justification that you have found acceptable enough for doing so?
In my view, the attack launched by the U.S. and Israel on Iran is a violation of international law. It is the crime of aggression that the U.S. and other allies charged against Germany at Nuremberg. It's also the crime of aggression on which the European countries will be creating a court to try the leadership of Russia for its attack on Ukraine with a full-scale invasion in February of 2012. Certainly there's concern and justifiable concern about nuclearization of Iran, but there are peaceful ways and agreements and negotiations that have frankly even completed in 2015. There was not this year, on February 28th, an imminent threat of attack by Iran against the U.S. or Israel. It's not some future fear that you may have. It has to be imminent. And thus the action in launching the attack, assassinating the leaders, was a violation of international law.
Right. So then I would really want to ask you, do you really think that it was America's war by any chance?
Well, obviously, it was America justified is the question, I suppose, and obviously there are arguments about the need to about Iran, of course, the nuclear issue, the support of militia such as Hezbollah that's created such issues in Lebanon and other countries in the region, and in Syria, a country which I've been deeply involved in, and a variety of things that we were concerned about in terms of Iranian policy. But that did not allow the United States to launch an invasion, to begin a war that requires an imminent threat. And so it wasn't for America, it wasn't for Israel, it wasn't for any other country to launch that attack, but to proceed with Iran to resolve those issues diplomatically.
So do you think that it was a case of US never really learning from its past mistakes at all?
Well, indeed, obviously, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, led to some very challenging consequences. A leader that had a horrible human rights record was overthrown, but a country was cast into a civil war, destabilizing it and causing mass violence over the course of several years, and only now emerging. And certainly, even from a strategic consequence, one ended up with an Iraq that was more pro-Iranian than it had been beforehand under Saddam, and it actually undermined U.S. policy. So as someone who opposed that particular attack, which was also unjustified, also the crime of aggression, on which the United States was joined by the United Kingdom, most other allies declined to join, it cost more in terms of U.S. interest and in the interests of the people of Iraq than it gained. And it's an example of why this doesn't work. I mean, I'm a believer that sometimes done with allies and because of particular threats to of genocide or horrible atrocity crimes, sometimes it's possible to make very limited interventions, always preferably with the support of the United Nations and with resolutions passed by the Security Council, but not these attacks that come in with 1,000, 2,000-pound bombs and destroy a great deal of the country and undermine any humanitarian purpose. The ICC statute makes it clear, at least as that statute was amended now 10 years ago, that this is the crime of aggression. This is not any of the justifications for aggression because it basically goes to the UN Charter, which 195 countries are parties, that prohibits the use of force except in self-defense or except when authorized by the UN
I'm
Security
also
Council under Chapter
really
7.
Curious about your thoughts on something President Donald Trump has said. You must have read the various statements he has been given, he has been giving over the last few weeks, not the worst of which was, of course, the whole civilization will die tonight. He was referring to Iran. What were your thoughts to such statements made by Donald Trump?
Well, and I spoke about that at the time, and it first of all, to even threaten such a thing, to threaten something in order to terrorize the country, even the threat, as I read the Geneva Conventions, an additional protocol, one of the Geneva Conventions of 1977, which is part of international customary law, whether any state have ratified it or not, it applies. One cannot threaten to terrorize a country in order to accomplish some political end. So the threat in and of itself is a crime. Obviously, it didn't happen, and it didn't happen. Obviously, it's possible that at the end of this sort of broken ceasefire, which is being observed in part, Trump could proceed with this. But and certainly, if he did destroy a whole civilization, attack civilian infrastructure, destroy the power plants, make the country uninhabitable, return it to the Stone Age, another term that was used by he and his Secretary of Defense, Texas. If he did that, those would be definitely war crimes. But even the threat is a war crime. So he's already culpable for that. Additionally, and I'm a senior fellow at the Center for the Prevention of Genocide in the United States, the threat, this kind of civilizational destruction runs the risk of even being genocidal. Now, it doesn't explicitly say we're going to destroy the people in whole or significant part, but obviously it's suggesting something so dramatic that it destroys the ability of those people to survive. In my earlier part of my career, I was a prosecutor at the Rwanda Tribunal in Arusha, Tanzania, and led the prosecution of the media leaders who had incited the genocide of the minority through broadcasts, and we were successful in convicting them for direct and public incitement to genocide. And that crime does not require that the genocide actually happened. Now, it happened in Rwanda. It doesn't require an actual show of causation. Even making those kinds of statements, which others may follow, if it's in a context where it could happen, can be the crime. I don't think we've quite crossed the line to this, but it's certainly something where the U.S. was in its leadership was violating the provisions of the Genocide Convention, of which the U.S. is a party, to prevent genocide and to take all actions to prevent this kind of thing from occurring. And using that kind of rhetoric is extremely, extremely dangerous. And I've spoken about that in regard to other countries and those kinds of statements. And obviously, if that kind of thing becomes commonplace, it undermines all of us. Some can say, well, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. But this is like threatening someone's children. And then maybe at the end of the day, they make a deal. It's still the crime of extortion to do that in the first place. So this is the kind of rhetoric that is contrary to everything that I think my country stands for when it's done positive things in the world, and that is usually involved, working together with other countries in humanitarian interests and ensuring through their own means their own security.
Ambassador Stephen, one of the most crucial thing in this war is also about the humanitarian crisis, which continues to loom. Do you really think the collapse of negotiations somewhere or the other reflect a failure of diplomacy, or do you think that is it a deliberate strategy to justify military escalation?
Well, I mean, from a political standpoint, Trump's launched a war without any end game that makes sense. And as we know, before February 28th, the Strait of Hormuz, through which India and countries of South Asia, East Asia, and Europe and Africa receive that necessary fuel. That strait was open, as it should be under international law, to the free passage of goods and fuel and other things. And then in reaction to this attack and the killing of leadership and the bombing of the country, which includes certainly some situations like the attack on the school that may in and of themselves be war crimes, the Iranians defend themselves by closing the Straits of Hormuz. Now, all of us, and I served in the Obama administration, know that if one got into a war with Iran, whatever our concerns are about nuclear weapons being gained by that regime, or whatever our concern about its dreadful record of human rights and shooting children and other demonstrators down in the streets, like they killed more than 10,000 on 2 days in January. We're very concerned, but the answer is to bring other pressures to bear and to engage in diplomacy. But then by attacking them, something that every government, every American sort of advocate, Israel always have wanted us to do this, they're able to strangle the world. And now to reopen that strait, and we're engaged in blockade, which furthers that strangulation. How we get out of this, how we end up in a situation that is anywhere near as good as we had on February 28th is very difficult. We have a ceasefire in which there's no active firing of missiles or drones back and forth with Iran at the moment, though of course there is an active conflict with Iranian proxy Hezbollah and Israel in Lebanon. But that ceasefire, of course, ends in a few days, and we can be back to active conflict. I'm hopeful that they will find some sort of negotiated way forward, which reopens the strait. But clearly, Iran will have greater control of that strait and be in a position to exact tolls and to regulate it in ways contrary to certainly American interests and the interests of countries in the region, and will add to the cost of necessary fuel. So there has to be a way forward diplomatically. I don't think Trump wants to engage in longer conflict with Iran, but he's put himself into a situation where if he stops, everyone will say you accomplished nothing. It was negative entirely. It was a horrendous mistake. And he wants to look like he's succeeded, but then to go forward, particularly to engage, to attack Karg Island and put American troops there, or to try to secure the straits by taking islands or taking land around it, would be a bloody conflict, which he doesn't want to engage in. And he was elected on the argument that he wouldn't engage in interventions like the United States did in Iraq. And so I think he's in a box. He can find some formula that will allow this conflict to end. But frankly, given this violation of international law, given the way the conflict has been conducted, the world will not be better off. Even if we had a ceasefire in place that was firm today than it was on February 28th.
Ambassador Stephen, you mentioned, of course, the Strait of Hormuz and how vital it is. And of course, you also said that diplomacy is the only way forward. Just a follow-up question. if a blockade in Strait of Hormuz, be it by US or by Iran, disrupts civilian economies globally, do you think that will be interpreted as collective punishment under the very international law?
Well, it's possible. Naval blockades are allowed under international law during a conflict. Understand, if the United States had begun this with a blockade, that would have been an act of war. But we're at war, no question about it. When you're bombing Tehran and killing its supreme leader and others, it's a war already. So the blockade is a continuation of war, in a war which was unjustified, as I said, under international law. A blockade is possible, but then it has to allow the passage of civilian goods through the blockade. But the focus of international law has always been on the blockaded country and on the need to provide humanitarian access so that people of Iran are not starving themselves. It's deprived of the necessities of life, the power to run electric generators, etc. Here, when we're talking about the effect of this blockade on the rest of the world, is an area where the law is really undeveloped. But obviously, it would seem to me that the effect of the blockade on countries in the region and on the access to fuel that's necessary and to other things that are required in the civilian economy and for human survival could raise an issue. The blockade, if it prevents the passage of all goods and effectively deprives other countries of necessities, and there's no other way for them to get them, it could cross that line. But international law is not as fully developed in this area as it is in the area of bombardment or even the besieging of cities, and besieging essentially being illegal unless you do provide the humanitarian access. And it's from that aspect of the law that we can project to determine what's legal in regard to a naval blockade.
Ambassador, before I let you go, my very last question to you will be about, of course, the peace talks which happened between United States and Israel in Pakistan. Of course, there were no positive results of it. But do you think that somewhere or the other did Pakistan help in attaining mediation between United States and Israel? Do you think the talks were really effective or they were not?
Well, I mean, it's in every situation in the world one finds one seeks out countries that have access to both sides. Obviously, I think it's good that that there's a place to meet, and that it was possible for the U.S. and Iran at a high level with the Speaker of their parliament and the Vice President of the United States actually having a high-level contact, and we really haven't done that in 47 years. So there are always, venues. I remember when the Russians under the Soviets organized meetings in Tashkent during Pakistan-India conflicts in the 60s. So you find a country, you may not like their politics in other ways, but if they've got a relationship with both sides, it's good that platform is available. Thus far, it's not gotten us very far, except for the fact that the parties engaged for 16 hours. And clearly, I hope that negotiations continue. There's talk of that on Thursday, perhaps not in Islamabad, but in Geneva. And obviously, we want to see that go forward because this conflict needs to end.
Absolutely, Ambassador Stephen. A lot of crucial points which you mentioned for our viewers here. Really appreciate your time. Of course, at the end of the day, all the world is only seeking for mediation and a positive result in the Middle East war.